Alright, the Dearth, Chapter 4. Can you hear me okay?
I believe so.
Okay. Chapter 4 is called The Fruit of the Dearth. I almost said British. Having seen what is happening today in Chapter 2, having noted here some of the technical aspects and caveats of the demographic trade in Chapter 3, it is now time to look ahead. Let us take advantage of the fact that demographers do know something about the future. Let us build our model of the future on the following simple assumptions. 1. That the current fertility rates in each of the Western nations will remain at the latest levels available in 1985, despite the fact that some nations' rates have fallen even further since these projections were run, and despite the fact that, upon examination of the data, many distinguished demographers believe the TFRs will fall somewhat lower in the course of the next few years, and very few demographers believe rates will climb. For the United States, our World Bank/UN model uses a TFR of 1.815, which is actually a trifle higher than the latest 1986 provisional US rates. 2. That the admixture of legal and illegal immigration rates in the U.S. remain at levels described in the previous chapter. Only the U.S. among the big Western nations takes in sufficient numbers of immigrants to make a serious demographic dent. 3. That fertility rates in the third world nations, now very high but declining, will continue to decline over the years, as projected by the UN. 4. That longevity rates will continue to rise, as projected by the United Nations. Under such circumstances, what does the future look like if we divide the world into 3 parts? The Western nations, the communist bloc, and the less developed nations. Observe first the rate of population growth in the whole Western community, looking 30 years back, and then looking 100 years into the future. The data is plotted in 5-year chunks. The future, quote-unquote, data here and in the pages that follow are based on special projections prepared by Ms. Mai T. Vu, a demographer from the Department of Population, Health and Nutrition of the World Bank, using the assumptions just mentioned. The graph on the opposite page reveals a clear story. There was rapid growth in the Western world due to the baby boom. There is now slower growth, but still growth, due to the echo effect of the baby boom and increased longevity. There will be no growth by the early years of the next century due to the birth dearth. Then there will be shrinkage, also due to the birth dearth. If the projections hold, that will be the story of the future in the Western world. Slow growth, no growth, shrinkage. Just as the TFRs ultimately show up as growth rates, so growth rates ultimately translate into actual population levels. The chart on page 32 shows projected total population for the Western nations. Again, a similar tale. Rapid earlier growth, slow growth now, no growth coming soon, decline shortly thereafter. These data are for all Western nations. Similar numbers and graphs are shown for the US on pages 53 and 55. Data for Western Europe alone are to be found on page 94. These scenarios yield several powerful ideas, some obvious, some not so obvious. Clearly, as can be seen graphically, both population growth rates and levels in the Western world are either immediately or shortly headed downward. Still, because of the echo effect of the baby boom and increasing longevity, the time of population plateau is delayed until a decade or two into the next century. Only then does an actual population decline begin. After all, in a nation of 250 million people like the US, a decline of a few 100,000 births per year takes a very long time to yield a positive to negative impact. That was so even for a country like West Germany, with much lower birth rates. But sooner or later decline sets in, as in actually happening now in West Germany and a few other Western European nations. As will be seen later in some detail, the process may take a heavy economic, geopolitical, personal, and social toll. In any event, this is how the demographic scenario generally plays out. As the birth-dearth trend begins, it means relatively fewer babies. That means a few years later, fewer students in elementary school and high school. That is about where we are now in the US. That situation, for certain people, has already changed the economic landscape. If you were a school teacher in Europe, it may have meant a layoff. If you worked in a plant in the US producing toys for children, or worked selling imported toys for children, you may have lost your overtime pay or some extra commission pay. If you currently run a McDonald's franchise in America or Italy, it may mean that it is beginning to get difficult to find teenage help. If you were a teenager working in a McDonald's, you might now earn a higher hourly rate because the Burger King in the same neighborhood was also running out of teenagers and hence bidding up the wage scale. But the major effect of the birth-dearth has not quite appeared in most places, although will be coming over the horizon at us tomorrow. In the US, for example, the birth-dearth began in earnest in 1972, about when it began in most of the rest of the Western world. So by 1987, the oldest American BD babies were already 15 years old. At the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, and that is just a microsecond as demographers reckon, the first thin and shallow wave of BD babies will be graduating from secondary schools across most of the Western world. Many of this sparse generation will be moving directly into labor markets of one sort or another, including the military. In the mid-1990s, these BD babies will be college graduates, moving into higher-level occupational slots, and, significantly, beginning to marry and form families of their own. In the latter part of the 90s, the first of the birth-dearth babies will be the thin crop from which young executives and managers will be chosen. All the while, unless there is a radical change in fertility patterns, there will be fewer and fewer babies born in the Western world, and thus fewer and fewer infants, children, and teenagers as the years roll on. It will be an undulating, fluctuating number in some countries due to earlier fertility patterns, which cause temporary bumps in the numbers of births. But the number will be undulating and fluctuating in a downward direction. These young people will be the echo effect of the birth-dearth as it continues. A slender crop of the sons and daughters of the slender crop of BD babies. Then they will mature, ready for adulthood, a decade or two after the turn of the century. In most Western nations, they will be living in countries that have already been depopulating in an absolute sense. In some others, the actual decline will be imminent or close to imminent. So, the first shriveled fruit of the birth-dearth is already upon us. They are already teenagers. Oh my God, teenagers. They will soon be young adults. The impact of the diminishing numbers of young people will be mostly harmful, I believe, and moreover, will likely intensify with each passing year. The demographics can get complicated. Let us see if all this can be made graphic and put into an American context. One image has dominated recent American demographics: the pig in the python. It is a convenient metaphor to explain the progress of the post-World War II baby boom. Picture a python, a big, long snake, hungry, yum. He catches a fair-sized pig and swallows it. Gobble, gobble, suck, suck. It actually says that.
I know.
As the doomed pig moves through the snake's digestive tract, and as I understand reptilian physiology, I'm sure you do, a snake is not much more than a head in a very active digestive tract. We see the outline of the pig over a period of time. The moving bump in the python, the poor pig, represents the massive cohort of baby boom babies as they got older. Thus, oh, okay. Put the camera down a little, so I can flip it over to the page. So it's showing the dearth of baby boomers, I guess, as a pig being eaten by a python.
Alright, got it.
Okay, I don't really get it.
It's kind of silly.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, mine too. Like, oh yeah, stick in. Oh, there's more.
We don't have to show it. Just explain the page number.
Right. But in the era of the birth dearth, we clearly need a new image. I offer this, the case of the starving snake. In the abstract, excluding for a moment the earlier baby boom bump for simplicity's sake, the hungry reptile, afflicted with birth dearthitis, would look this way over a period of years. So there's a starving snake, I guess, and they're really skinny near the head.
What page is it?
It is page 36 and 37.
Alright.
Okay. Wow. Skinny snake. Okay. After a while, in this stylized model, you clearly end up with an even skinnier and skinnier snake. In the real world, of course, there is still that earlier bump of the baby boom. So the progress of the real snake, stylized again, would look something like this. Okay, chart 4D, the starving snake, that's on 36. And then 37 is chart for E, confused python, which shows it's kind of like a mix of the starving snake and then just a big bump of the baby boom at the end of it. And then the tail looks not as starving, just in its quoted normal fertility. That is a confused snake, to be sure. But its prognosis is clear. It will keep getting skinnier unless something changes. That's not all. After a while, just to finish up with snakes, it not only gets skinnier, it gets skinnier faster and faster. Demography at its mathematical root is a science that deals with multiplying and dividing more than with adding and subtracting. It deals with geometric progressions rather than arithmetic progressions. That point was made early on by the patron saint of doomsayers, Thomas Malthus. The idea is obvious on a small scale. Consider, if 2 parents have 4 children, they have doubled their number in a single generation. Then suppose each of the children in turn takes a spouse, and each new couple continues to beget 4 children. At that rate, after only 9 generations, there will be 1,024 offspring. That is geometric growth. We don't add, we multiply. And so, demographers, thinking geometrically, often talk about the doubling time of a population. Such calculations can yield big numbers quickly, and the big numbers lend themselves easily to horrific metaphors like population explosion or population population bomb. Now, however, there is talk in the demographic community of halving times, having like half. A population trend that is losing numbers because of below replacement fertility also proceeds geometrically, not arithmetically. Suppose we choose a model that, for simplicity's sake, deals with 2 parents who produce only 1 child. That population has been halved in a single generation. Work that backward. Start with 1,024 adults, divided into 512 couples. After 9 generations, with the TFR at 1.0, not that far away from the present West German rate, the population of 1,024 people is reduced to 2 people. On the Malthusian downside, we don't subtract, we divide. The moral of this particular demographic tale is clear. Once they get started, things can move very quickly. In our current birth-dearth situation, the momentum effect discussed earlier will begin to change direction, yielding, at least in theory, not a geometric population explosion in the West, but a geometric population implosion. Reviewing the chart on page 32, it is apparent that Western population will drop, with growing speed, by about 200 million souls if present fertility continues through the next century. In abstract theory, if one turns the crank for another few centuries, you could end up with hardly any people at all, yielding not ZPG, zero population growth, but ZP, zero population. Nations of empty camper trailers, Germans, Japanese, Dutch, and even Americans, except for a few new immigrants, of course. Okay. Now, all this geometric stuff can certainly be overdone. It was overdone by some explosionists who, when fertility rates were high everywhere, predicted a world of near wall-to-wall people. I do not intend to fall into the same trap. It is surely not likely that these birth-dearth rates will continue indefinitely. Geometric trends, up or down, usually don't. A more serious question to consider is not whether this trend will stop, but when. To understand the impact of that question, one must note that even the beginnings of such a downward spiral, which has already happened, will change our world. For example, because of BD-level birth rates in the early 1970s, many Western European nations will have to extend the terms of service for their military draftees. Germany already has. If the birth-dearth continues for another generation or 2 or 3, the changes it will wreak on our world will not be as simple as changing draft laws. It will change the world in a major way, perhaps beyond current recognition. Why so? First, because the longer it lasts, the harder it becomes for nations to go back to where they were, or even to stabilize at where they are. Demographic momentum works negatively once a tipping point has been reached. After an actual population decline has proceeded for a while, a shift to a 2.1 TFR not only doesn't take a nation back immediately to where the nation was, but the decline may continue for decades as deaths from fatter pre-BD cohorts outnumber births from skinny BD cohorts. Of course, if women in the next century decide to have 4 or 5 children each, things could change quickly. Does anyone believe that will happen? I don't know. And secondly, in thinking about change in the West, we might remember that the free modern nations do not exist in a vacuum on this planet. In a world of linked economies and geopolitical alliances that girdle the globe, the destinies of the Western nations are inextricably tied to developments elsewhere. So, to see what happens, let us continue our model making. Let us follow through by looking at the rest of the world through the lens of a simplified 3-part division of the peoples inhabiting this globe of ours.